You dodged the draft while we bled in Vietnam. The veteran's accusation cut through Elvis's performance like a knife, silencing 15,000 people in an instant. Sergeant Mike Patterson stood in the front row, his purple heart glinting under the stage lights, tears streaming down his weathered face as he pointed directly at the king of rock and roll. Elvis had been performing American Trilogy when the devastating words stopped him cold, the microphone falling silent as the Memorial Day crowd held its breath. What Elvis said next would either destroy his career or unite an entire arena in ways nobody could have imagined. But to understand why this confrontation would shake the very foundation of American entertainment, you need to know about a soldier who came home from hell only to find that his country had forgotten him. Because this story begins 30 minutes earlier when Sergeant Patterson walked into Liberty Memorial Arena carrying wounds that went far deeper than the shrapnel still lodged in his chest. It was Memorial Day 1976 at the Liberty Memorial Arena in Springfield. Elvis was performing a special tribute concert for military families. Sergeant Mike Patterson, a 45-year-old Vietnam veteran, had reluctantly agreed to attend at his wife's insistence. Patterson clutched his program, reading about Elvis's charitable work, his support for military families. But something burned inside him, something that had been festering for 8 years since he'd dragged his wounded body out of a rice paddy near Da Nang. He'd watched his brothers die while celebrities lived in mansions, and tonight that anger was about to explode. Elvis moved through his opening numbers with his usual magnetism. The crowd was electric, singing along to That's All Right and Hound Dog. But when he transitioned into American Trilogy, something shifted in Patterson's chest. The medley began with Dixie, moved through Battle Hymn of the Republic, and was building toward All My Trials. Oh, I wish I was in the land of cotton, Elvis sang, his voice soaring across the arena. The crowd swayed, caught in the patriotic moment. But in the front row, Patterson's hands began to shake, not from fear, from rage. The memories came flooding back, the helicopter landing zones, the screaming wounded, the letters he'd written to families whose sons weren't coming home. And here was Elvis Presley, who'd gotten a deferment while better men died, singing about trials he'd never faced. Old times there are not forgotten, Elvis continued, lost in the music, unaware of the storm building just 15 feet away. Patterson's purple heart felt heavy against his chest. He'd earned it when shrapnel from a mortar round had torn through his squad, killing 3 and leaving him permanently disabled in his left arm. His wife Nancy reached for his hand, sensing his distress. "Mike, please," she whispered. "Let's just enjoy the music." But Patterson was beyond reason now. The final straw came when Elvis sang the line, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on." Patterson's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. His movement caught Elvis's attention immediately. The king's performer instincts, honed by decades of reading audiences, told him something was wrong. He could see an older man standing, tears visible on his face, his body trembling with emotion. Elvis slowed his singing, uncertain whether this was adoration or something else entirely. The band continued playing, but softly now as thousands of eyes turned toward the front row. Patterson's purple heart caught the stage lights, a small flash that somehow seemed to illuminate everything wrong with the moment. "You dodged the draft while we bled in Vietnam." Patterson's voice exploded across the arena like a gunshot. The accusation was so unexpected, so raw with pain, that it seemed to suck all the air out of the massive space. Elvis stopped singing mid-word. The band stumbled to a halt. 15,000 people sat in stunned, absolute silence. Elvis stood frozen, his white jumpsuit suddenly feeling like a costume, his microphone hanging uselessly in his hand. For a moment that felt like eternity, the king of rock and roll had no word. Patterson remained standing, his finger still pointed at Elvis, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. "You sang songs while we carried body bags," Patterson continued, his voice breaking. "You made millions while we came home to nothing." The pain in his voice was so raw that several people in the audience began crying just hearing it. This wasn't a heckler or a drunk fan. This was a broken warrior demanding answers. Nancy Patterson tugged at her husband's sleeve. "Mike, sit down, please." But Sergeant Patterson had carried this burden for 8 years, And he wasn't stopping now. Security guards began moving toward him, but Elvis held up his hand, stopping them immediately. The arena waited. Cameras stopped rolling. Even the photographers lowered their equipment, sensing they were witnessing something too sacred for flashbulbs. Elvis looked directly at Patterson, studying the man's face, his posture, the Purple Heart that marked him as someone who had sacrificed in ways Elvis never had. "What's your name, sir?" Elvis asked quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, despite its gentleness. The question was so unexpected that it took Patterson off guard. He'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe security removing him. He hadn't expected Sergeant Mike Patterson, 1st Infantry Division. Patterson replied automatically, his military bearing reasserting itself even through his emotional breakdown. 2 tours, 1968 to 1970. His voice carried the authority of a man who'd earned his right to speak. Elvis nodded slowly. "Sergeant Patterson," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the words. "You served 2 tours." The question wasn't defensive. It was genuinely interested, respectful. Patterson nodded, uncertain where this was going. "Were you at Da Nang?" Elvis asked. The specificity of the question surprised Patterson. Most civilians threw around Vietnam place names without understanding what they meant. But Elvis had asked about Da Nang specifically, one of the bloodiest areas of the conflict. "Near there," Patterson confirmed. "Fibrace Charlie, mostly. Some ops near the city." He found himself answering despite his anger. There was something in Elvis's tone that commanded respect. "Soldier to something else." "Not soldier," Patterson reminded himself. Elvis had never been a soldier. Elvis set down his microphone and stepped closer to the edge of the stage. The arena was so quiet that his footsteps echoed. "Sergeant Patterson," he said, his voice now conversational but carrying to every corner of the building. "You're absolutely right to be angry." The admission hit the crowd like thunder. 15,000 people exhaled simultaneously, a sound like wind through trees. No one had expected Elvis to agree with his accuser. Patterson's finger lowered slightly, his expression shifting from pure rage to confusion. "You're right," Elvis continued. "You bled. You sacrificed. You lost friends. And I was here, safe, making music." He paused, looking directly into Patterson's eyes. "And I've carried that knowledge every day since this war started." Something in Elvis's voice made Patterson's anger waver. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected. This wasn't a celebrity trying to deflect criticism. This sounded like confession. "But Sergeant," Elvis continued, stepping even closer to the edge of the stage, "I want to tell you something that might change how you see this moment." The arena leaned forward collectively. Even Patterson found himself waiting, his anger temporarily suspended by curiosity. "My uncle Billy Presley died in Korea in 1951, Elvis said quietly. "He was 22 years old, never came home, never got to meet his son." The revelation stunned the crowd. Most people knew about Elvis's twin brother Jesse, who had died at birth, but this family military connection was news to almost everyone present. Patterson's expression shifted again. "I didn't know," he said, his voice smaller now but still audible. "But that doesn't change." Elvis held up his hand gently. "You're right. It doesn't change anything about your service or your sacrifice." Elvis agreed. "But it might explain why I've spent the last 8 years trying to honor veterans through my music and my charity work. Not because I had to, but because I needed to." The word "needed" carried weight that surprised Patterson. This wasn't public relations. This was personal pain being shared publicly. "Every time I perform American Trilogy," Elvis continued, "I think about Uncle Billy. And I think about men like you, Sergeant Patterson. Men who answered the call I never got." "You got deferments," Patterson said, but the accusation had lost its fire. Now it sounded more like a question. "Student deferment first, then occupational." Elvis nodded. "I did, and I've wondered every day since whether that was right." The admission was stunning in its honesty. "My manager, my record label, my mother, they all said I could do more good continuing my career, supporting the war effort through entertainment. But late at night, Sergeant, I wondered if I was just a coward hiding behind excuses." The vulnerability in Elvis's voice was affecting everyone in the arena. This wasn't the confident king of rock and roll. This was a man admitting to doubt, to guilt, to questions he'd never resolved. Patterson found his anger transforming into something else. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. I won't insult you by claiming my guilt compares to your sacrifice. Elvis continued, but I will tell you that I've tried to earn the right to sing these songs by supporting the families of men who didn't come home. The Presley Foundation has sent over 200 Gold Star families' children to college. Not because it makes headlines, but because it needed to be done. Patterson was quiet now, processing this information. His wife Nancy reached up and gently took his hand. "Mike," she whispered, "maybe you should sit down." But Patterson remained standing, his eyes locked on Elvis. "Why didn't you ever talk about this publicly?" Patterson asked. "About your uncle? About the guilt?" It was a fair question, and Elvis considered it carefully before answering. "Because it felt like using a dead man to make myself look better." Elvis replied, "Uncle Billy died for his country. That sacrifice shouldn't be used to polish my reputation." The answer carried the ring of truth that made Patterson nod slowly. "Besides," Elvis continued, "what right did I have to claim kinship with military families when I'd never worn the uniform myself?" It felt dishonest. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Patterson looked around the arena, suddenly aware that 15,000 people were watching this conversation. Many were crying. Veterans throughout the crowd were nodding, their own complex emotions about the war reflected in this unexpected dialogue between a soldier and a star. "Sergeant Patterson," Elvis said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Patterson nodded. "Do you think it's possible for someone to serve their country without wearing a uniform?" The question forced Patterson to think beyond his anger. "Yes, I suppose so," he answered slowly. "Teachers, doctors, people who keep the country running while we're overseas." Elvis nodded. "What about someone who entertains troops, who raises money for veterans' families, who uses their platform to keep Americans' spirits up during wartime?" Elvis's questions weren't defensive. They were genuinely seeking Patterson's opinion. Patterson considered this. "Maybe," he said, "if they were really committed to it, if it wasn't just for show." The qualifier was important, and Elvis understood its significance. "Then let me show you something," Elvis said. He turned to someone off stage and gestured. Within moments, a man in a suit approached the microphone Elvis had abandoned. "This is James Murphy, director of the Presley Foundation," Elvis announced. Murphy stepped forward, nervous. "Sergeant Patterson," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "In the last 8 years, the Presley Foundation has provided $2.3 million in direct support to veterans' families, college scholarships, medical bills, housing assistance. Ms. Presley has visited wounded soldiers in 47 different hospitals, almost always without media present." The numbers hit Patterson like physical blows. $2.3 million. 47 hospitals. This wasn't public relations. This was commitment. "Why," Patterson asked, looking back at Elvis, "why go to all that trouble if you felt guilty?" "Because guilt without action is just selfishness," Elvis replied. "If I felt bad about not serving, the answer wasn't to feel sorry for myself. It was to find other ways to serve." The logic was simple, direct, and undeniably sincere. Patterson felt something shifting inside him. The rage that had sustained him for 8 years wasn't disappearing, but it was transforming into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. Recognition that maybe service came in different forms. "I still think you should have served," Patterson said quietly. "I think every able-bodied American should have shared the burden." Elvis nodded immediately. "You're absolutely right," he agreed. "And I can't change that now. But I can spend the rest of my life trying to honor the men who did serve. Men like you, Sergeant." The response surprised Patterson again. No defensiveness, no excuses, just acknowledgement and commitment. "What happened to you over there?" Elvis asked gently. "If you don't mind sharing." The question opened a door Patterson had kept locked for years. "Mortar attack on our firebase," Patterson said slowly. 3 of my men died. I took shrapnel in my chest and arm. Spent 4 months in a hospital in Japan. Then another 6 months at Walter Reed. The clinical recitation didn't capture the horror, but it gave the facts. "Do you still have pain?" Elvis asked. Patterson was surprised by the personal nature of the question. "Some," he admitted. "The docs say the shrapnel in my chest is too close to vital organs to remove. I live with it." Elvis was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Sergeant," he said finally, "I want to do something for you. Not because I think it makes us even. Nothing could do that. But because you deserve recognition for your service." Patterson was wary. What kind of recognition? He'd been disappointed by empty gestures before. Too many politicians had made promises they didn't keep. "I want to finish this concert with you," Elvis said. "I want you to come up here and help me sing American Trilogy." Not as Elvis and a fan, but as two Americans honoring the men who didn't come home. The offer stunned Patterson. "I can't sing," he protested. "I'm not a performer." Elvis smiled, the first real smile since the confrontation began. "Neither was Uncle Billy, but I bet he had a voice. And I bet your buddies who didn't come home had voices too. Sing for them, Sergeant. Let this arena hear what a real American hero sounds like." The invitation was so unexpected, so sincere, that Patterson found himself nodding before he'd fully processed what he was agreeing to. "Okay," he said quietly. "For my buddies who didn't make it home." Elvis extended his hand down from the stage. Patterson took it, and with surprising strength, Elvis helped pull him up onto the platform. The arena erupted in applause, but it wasn't the usual screaming Elvis fan. This was respectful, moved applause from people who recognized they were witnessing something sacred. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said into his microphone, "I want you to meet Sergeant Mike Patterson, 1st Infantry Division, 2 tours in Vietnam, Purple Heart recipient. He's going to help me finish American Trilogy tonight." The applause grew louder, and Patterson could see veterans throughout the arena standing, saluting. His anger was gone now, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride in having confronted Elvis, but pride in being acknowledged as what he was, a soldier who had done his duty. Elvis positioned Patterson beside him at the microphone. "Just follow my lead," he said quietly. "And remember, we're not singing for these people. We're singing for the ones who can't sing anymore." The band began the familiar opening of American Trilogy again, but this time it felt different. The notes carried weight they hadn't before. When Elvis began "Oh, I Wish I Was in the Land of Cotton," Patterson found himself joining in, his voice rough but strong. As they moved into Battle Hymn of the Republic, something magical happened. Patterson's military bearing, his genuine emotion, his obvious sincerity began affecting the entire arena. People weren't just listening to entertainment anymore. They were witnessing testimony. "Glory, glory, hallelujah," they sang together. Elvis's polished voice, blending with Patterson's raw honesty. "His truth is marching on." When they reached that line, Patterson's voice cracked with emotion, and Elvis put his arm around the veteran's shoulders, supporting. The final section, "All My Trials," became something neither man had expected. As they sang "All my trials, Lord, soon be over," Patterson began crying again. But these weren't tears of anger anymore. These were tears of release, of recognition, of something approaching peace. When the song ended, the arena exploded. But again, this wasn't typical concert applause. People were on their feet, many crying, all recognizing they'd witnessed something unprecedented. Veterans throughout the crowd were saluting. Families were hugging. Something had been healed in that building. Elvis turned to Patterson as the applause continued. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said quietly. "You taught me something tonight." Patterson looked at him curiously. "You taught me that real courage isn't avoiding confrontation. It's facing truth, even when it hurts." Patterson wiped his eyes. "You taught me something too," he replied. "You taught me that service comes in different forms, and that maybe the country needs entertainers as much as it needs soldiers." The two men shook hands on stage, and the photograph of that moment would become iconic. The king of rock and roll and the Vietnam veteran, both crying, both changed by their encounter. As Patterson prepared to return to his seat, Elvis stopped him. "Sergeant, one more thing," he said. I'd like to visit your local VA hospital next week. Not for publicity, just to meet some of your buddies who are still fighting their own battles. Would you show me around?" Patterson was stunned. "You'd do that?" Elvis nodded. "It would be an honor, Sergeant. If you'll have me." Patterson found himself smiling for the first time in months. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." As Patterson made his way back to his seat, Elvis addressed the audience one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we learned something important. We learned that America is strong not because we all agree, but because we can face our disagreements with respect and honesty." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "Sergeant Patterson had every right to challenge me tonight, and I hope I proved worthy of his challenge, because that's what we do for each other in this country. We hold each other accountable. We demand the best from our leaders, our entertainers, and ourselves." The crowd was silent, absorbing the lesson. "Some of you tonight came here for entertainment, but I hope you leave with something more important. The understanding that we're all in this together. Veterans and civilians, performers and audiences, young and old, we're all Americans, and we all have a responsibility to take care of each other." Elvis picked up his guitar and began the opening chords of "How Great Thou Art." But this time, he dedicated it to all the men and women who have served, who are serving, and who will serve our great nation. As he sang, Patterson remained standing at his seat, hand over his heart, finally at peace with the war that had defined his life. The concert ended with a standing ovation that lasted 15 minutes. But more importantly, it ended with understanding. Patterson and his wife Nancy met Elvis backstage afterward, and the three of them talked for another hour about the war, about healing, about the different ways people serve their country. True to his word, Elvis visited the Springfield VA hospital the following week. Patterson gave him a tour, introducing him to dozens of veterans who were struggling with wounds both visible and invisible. Elvis spent the entire day there. No cameras, no publicity, just a man keeping a promise to a soldier. The story of Elvis and Sergeant Patterson spread quickly, but not as gossip or entertainment news. It spread as an example of how Americans could disagree respectfully, challenge each other honestly, and find common ground even in the most difficult circumstances. The impact of that Memorial Day confrontation extended far beyond the Liberty Memorial Arena. Within weeks, video footage of Elvis and Sergeant Patterson singing together had spread across the country, becoming a symbol of reconciliation during a time when America was still divided over Vietnam. Major news networks picked up the story, but not as entertainment gossip. Walter Cronkite dedicated an entire segment to what he called a masterclass in American discourse. The footage showed two men from completely different worlds finding common ground through honesty, respect, and the willingness to be vulnerable. Patterson received hundreds of letters from fellow veterans who had struggled with similar anger and resentment. Many credited his confrontation with Elvis as inspiring them to seek their own healing. Seeing Mike stand up and speak his truth, then watching how Elvis responded, "It showed me there might be a path forward," wrote one Marine veteran from California. Elvis's visit to the Springfield VA hospital the following week became a model for celebrity veteran outreach. Unlike typical photo opportunities, Elvis spent individual time with each veteran, listening to their stories, learning about their struggles. He didn't just pose for pictures, he asked questions, took notes, and made commitments. Dr. Rebecca Stevens, the chief psychiatrist at Springfield VA, later wrote about Elvis's visit in the Journal of Military Psychology. Mr. Presley demonstrated something remarkable that day. He showed that healing veterans isn't about pity or charity. It's about recognition, respect, and the understanding that these men and women have experiences and wisdom that can benefit all of us. One veteran Elvis met that day was Tony Rodriguez, a Marine who had lost both legs to a landmine near Khe Sanh. Tony had been suicidal, unable to find purpose in his civilian life. Elvis sat with me for an hour. Tony recalled years later. He didn't try to cheer me up or tell me everything would be okay. He asked me what I missed most about being a Marine. Tony's answer surprised even himself: the brotherhood, knowing that the guy next to you would die for you. Elvis nodded thoughtfully. What if we could create that brotherhood here? What if veterans could find that same connection helping other veterans? That conversation led to the founding of the Patterson-Presley Veterans Support Network, a peer counseling program that paired combat veterans with others struggling with readjustment. Tony Rodriguez became its first coordinator, finding new purpose in helping his fellow veterans navigate the challenges of civilian life. The program started small, operating out of a donated storefront in Springfield, but within 5 years it had expanded to 12 cities, helping thousands of veterans find employment, housing, and most importantly, connection with others who understood their experience. Sergeant Patterson became the program's most effective counselor, not because of his confrontation with Elvis, but because of what he learned from it. I realized that anger was just pain with nowhere to go, he explained to new counselor. Once you give that pain a purpose, it transforms into something powerful. Patterson's approach was unconventional but effective. Instead of traditional therapy sessions, he organized what he called truth meeting. Veterans would gather in a circle, and each person would share one hard truth about their war experience, and one hard truth about their civilian life. No advice was given. The power was simply in being heard. Mike taught us that healing isn't about forgetting what happened, explained Sarah Chen, a nurse who had served in Vietnam and later became a program coordinator. It's about integrating those experiences into who you are now. The war doesn't have to define you, but it's part of your story. Elvis continued his involvement with the program until his death in 19. Every month he would visit a different chapter, not to perform but to listen. He funded the program's expansion and insisted that his contributions remain anonymous. This isn't about me, he told Patterson. It's about making sure veterans know they're not forgotten. The night Elvis died, Patterson was at his bedside, not as a fan but as a friend who had become family. He was worried about the veterans, Patterson recalled. Even at the end he was asking about Tony Rodriguez, about the program in Chicago, about whether we had enough funding for the next year. Patterson spoke at Elvis's funeral, representing the thousands of veterans whose lives had been touched by their unlikely friendship. Elvis taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear or guilt, he said. It's the willingness to face those feelings and transform them into service to others. The Patterson-Presley Veterans Support Network continued long after both men were gone. By 2000, it had helped over 50,000 veterans transition to civilian life. The model was adopted by the Department of Veterans Affairs and became the foundation for modern peer support program. In 2016, on the 40th anniversary of their confrontation, the Liberty Memorial Arena was renamed the Patterson-Presley Memorial Arena. The dedication ceremony featured veterans from every conflict since World War II, all testifying to the power of honest dialogue and mutual respect. Nancy Patterson, who had tried to quiet her husband that Memorial Day night, spoke at the dedication. Mike used to say that the worst thing about coming home from war wasn't the nightmares or the pain, she said. It was feeling like no one understood what you'd been through. Elvis showed him that understanding doesn't require shared experience, it just requires genuine care. The bronze plaque at the arena's entrance reads, "Dedicated to the courage it takes to speak truth and the wisdom it takes to hear it." Below that inscription is a sculpture of two men shaking hands, one in a military uniform, one in a jumpsuit, representing the moment when challenge became connection. Today, the Patterson-Presley model is taught in conflict resolution courses at universities across the country. Business schools use it as an example of transformational leadership. Military academies include it in their curricula on civilian-military relations. But perhaps the most important legacy is simpler: the understanding that disagreement doesn't have to lead to division. That challenge can lead to growth. That sometimes the people who confront us most directly are the ones offering us the greatest gift: the opportunity to become better than we were. Dr. Michael Patterson, Sergeant Patterson's son who became a psychiatrist specializing in veteran care, put it best. "My father taught me that healing happens when we stop defending our wounds and start sharing them." Elvis taught him that lesson, and together they taught it to thousands of others. The story of Elvis and Sergeant Patterson reminds us that America's greatest strength has always been its ability to have difficult conversations and emerge stronger. It shows us that real leadership isn't about being right. It's about being willing to be wrong and learning from. In our current era of polarization and conflict, Their example offers hope. It proves that even the deepest divisions can be bridged when people approach each other with genuine respect, honest vulnerability, and the willingness to see the humanity in those who challenge them. Most importantly, it demonstrates that sometimes the people who seem like our enemies are actually our teachers, offering us lessons we didn't know we needed to learn. Have you ever had someone challenge you in a way that ultimately made you better? Share your story in the comments. Because just like Elvis learned that Memorial Day, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is listen to those who push us to grow.